The three arrogant naval security guards had turned the main gate checkpoint into a theater of humiliation. Visitors shifted uncomfortably in the security line, and the young petty officer kept glancing nervously at his supervisor. Everyone felt sorry for the woman in the wheelchair. Everyone except for the stunning brunette woman herself. Her fearless calm was a provocation they couldn't resist. They saw a confused civilian trying to access a restricted military installation, an easy target for their authority. They had no idea they were about to face the fury of the United States Navy's most elite warriors. For more powerful videos about our military and naval heroes, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Commander Rebecca "Shark" Torres, 38 years old, sat perfectly still in her advanced wheelchair at the main gate of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, watching the morning security procedures unfold with the trained eye of someone who had designed many of these protocols herself. Her shoulder-length dark hair was pulled back in a regulation-style bun, and her steel-gray eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce through the California morning haze. She wore a simple black blazer over a white blouse and navy slacks, her appearance professional but understated. The titanium and carbon fiber of her military-grade wheelchair gleamed in the San Diego sunshine. The chair was a masterpiece of engineering, designed specifically for someone who refused to accept limitations. Custom-built with features that most people would never notice. Reinforced frame capable of handling extreme conditions, all-terrain wheels that could navigate sand and surf, and hidden compartments that spoke to a life lived in the shadows. Balanced on her lap was a black leather briefcase that had accompanied her through operations in every ocean on Earth. Inside were credentials that represented the pinnacle of naval special operations: Navy SEAL Trident, multiple combat deployment ribbons, and clearances that granted access to the nation's most sensitive military installations. Rebecca's career had been unprecedented from the beginning. She'd been part of the first class of women allowed to attempt SEAL training, and one of only 3 to complete the grueling 6-month program. Her instructors had called her Shark, not just because of her prowess in the water, but because of her relentless pursuit of excellence and her ability to strike with precision when least expected. She'd started in underwater demolition, specializing in harbor infiltration and coastal reconnaissance. But her tactical brilliance was unmistakable, and within 5 years she'd been promoted to team leader, commanding mixed-gender SEAL units on the most dangerous missions the Navy had to offer. Somalia, Yemen, the South China Sea, she'd led operations in hostile waters that other teams considered impossible. Her reputation for mission success was legendary. In 12 years of active duty, she'd never lost a team member, never failed to complete an objective, never compromised operational security. She'd been promoted to commander at 34, making her one of the youngest SEAL commanders in naval history. But it was her final mission that had truly cemented her legacy. 2 years ago, a Chinese submarine had suffered a catastrophic accident in international waters, trapping 37 sailors in a damaged hull that was slowly flooding. International maritime law required assistance, but the political situation was delicate. Any rescue attempt could be seen as espionage or provocation. Rebecca had volunteered to lead a humanitarian rescue mission, diving to depths that pushed the limits of human endurance, working in water so cold that exposure meant death in minutes. For 18 hours, she'd coordinated the rescue of every single Chinese sailor, personally making 7 dives to the crippled submarine. On her final ascent, carrying the last survivor, a catastrophic decompression event had damaged her spinal cord. She'd remained conscious long enough to ensure the Chinese sailor reached the surface safely, but the injury had ended her diving career and left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The Chinese government had quietly awarded her their highest civilian honor. The U.S. Navy had given her the Navy Cross. The international maritime community had created a new award specifically to recognize her actions. But Rebecca herself had refused most of the publicity, choosing instead to transition quietly to a consulting role, helping to train the next generation of naval special operations personnel. Today, she was here at Coronado for a classified briefing on new underwater rescue protocols, her expertise still considered essential despite her changed circumstances. She held the highest level security clearances and had been personally invited by the base commander. What the gate security team didn't know was that she'd helped design many of the security procedures they were now using to keep her out. At 0800 hours, the morning shift change brought a new security team to the main gate. Chief Petty Officer Rick Morrison, 32 years old and new to Coronado, had been assigned gate duty as part of his orientation to base security procedures. He'd spent his entire career on surface vessels and had no experience with special operations personnel or the unique protocols that governed their access. Beside him stood Petty Officer Second Class Jake Mitchell, 26 years old and frustrated with what he saw as a dead-end assignment. Mitchell had joined the Navy hoping for adventure and excitement, but had found himself stuck in shore duty, checking IDs and inspecting vehicles. He'd developed a chip on his shoulder about anyone who seemed to have achieved more than he had. The third member of the team was Petty Officer Third Class Maria Santos, 23 years old and fresh out of basic training. Santos was eager to prove herself, but had been conditioned to follow the lead of her more senior colleagues, even when her instincts told her something was wrong. As Rebecca approached the gate checkpoint, Chief Morrison noticed her wheelchair and immediately jumped to conclusions. In his limited experience, disabled civilians who approached military installations were usually tourists who had gotten lost, or families trying to visit active-duty relatives without proper authorization. "Ma'am, I think you might be looking for the visitor center," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the kind of condescending helpfulness that masked complete dismissal. "The base tour doesn't start until 1,000 hours, and you'll need to pre-register online." Rebecca looked up from the identification packet in her lap, her gray eyes meeting Morrison's gaze with the kind of steady calm that comes from having stared down armed adversaries in hostile territory. "I'm not here for a tour, Chief. I have a 083 briefing with the base commander." Morrison glanced at her civilian clothes, her wheelchair, and her lack of visible military identification, and his skepticism deepened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the base commander doesn't meet with civilians without going through proper channels. You'll need to contact the Public Affairs Office to schedule an appointment." Other people in the security line began to take notice. Military personnel and authorized civilians waiting for their own clearance watched as the confrontation began to unfold. Some looked sympathetic to the woman in the wheelchair, while others seemed annoyed at the delay in processing. "I do have proper authorization," Rebecca replied, her voice maintaining perfect control. "I'm Commander Rebecca Torres, and I'm here for a classified briefing on underwater rescue protocols." Petty Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his frustration with his assignment making him eager to assert whatever authority he possessed. "Commander? Ma'am, I don't see any uniform or visible rank insignia. If you're really a naval officer, where's your military ID?" The question revealed the depth of Mitchell's inexperience. Rebecca had been out of active duty for over a year, and retired personnel used different identification procedures for accessing military installations. But more importantly, someone of her clearance level often used civilian credentials for security reasons. "I'm retired Navy," Rebecca explained patiently. "I'm here on a consulting basis. My authorization should be in your system under my civilian credentials." Santos, who had been monitoring the computer terminal, looked up with confusion. "Chief, I'm not seeing any authorization for a Rebecca Torres. The only Commander Torres in our system is," she paused, reading from her screen, "Commander Rebecca Shark Torres, but that can't be right. She's what?" Rebecca asked quietly, sensing where this was leading. Mitchell had moved closer to Santos's terminal and was reading over her shoulder. "Says here Commander Torres is a Navy SEAL," he announced loudly enough for everyone in the security line to hear. "And last I checked, SEALs don't roll around in wheelchairs." The comment drew sharp intakes of breath from several people in line. An elderly man who appeared to be a military retiree shook his head in disgust. A young military spouse pulled her children closer, uncomfortable with the growing tension. But Rebecca didn't respond with anger or indignation. Instead, she reached into her briefcase with deliberate precision. "Chief Morrison, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of my authorization. Perhaps we could resolve this quietly?" Morrison's ego had become invested in maintaining his authority in front of his subordinates and the growing audience. "Ma'am, I don't care what your story is. SEALs are elite warriors, not disabled civilians making up stories to get onto a military base. I'm going to need you to turn around and leave, or I'll have to call the military police." The threat of involving the military police was the final straw for Rebecca. She'd spent 2 years trying to maintain a low profile, avoiding the spotlight that her rescue mission had brought her. She'd turned down book deals, declined movie offers, and refused speaking engagements that would have made her wealthy and famous. All she'd wanted was to continue serving her country in whatever capacity her changed circumstances allowed. But sometimes dignity isn't enough. Sometimes the world forces you to reveal who you really are, not because you want the attention, but because standing up to ignorance requires it. Rebecca opened her briefcase and began removing documents. Her retired military ID, her security clearance certificates, her consulting contract with the Department of Defense. But as she organized the papers, something else fell out. A small velvet box that tumbled to the asphalt with a soft thud. Petty Officer Santos, who was closest to the wheelchair, bent down to retrieve the box. As she picked it up, the lid came open, revealing the distinctive gold trident pin of the Navy SEALs, mounted on a bed of navy blue velvet. But this wasn't a standard trident. The gold was darker, the craftsmanship more detailed, and engraved around the edges were the words presented by the Secretary of the Navy for extraordinary heroism. Santos stared at the pin, her young face showing genuine confusion. She'd seen plenty of military decorations during her brief career, but nothing like this. "Chief," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Morrison took the box from Santos's hands, and his face went pale as he examined the contents. He'd been in the Navy long enough to recognize the significance of what he was holding. A Navy SEAL trident was impressive enough, but this was clearly something special, a presentation piece reserved for the most extraordinary circumstances. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I earned it," Rebecca replied simply. Mitchell, who had been watching the exchange, let out a derisive laugh. "Right. I'm sure the Navy gives out SEAL pins to people who collect military memorabilia. That thing's probably from a surplus store." But Chief Morrison was beginning to have doubts. The pin was clearly authentic. The weight, the craftsmanship, the official Navy markings couldn't be faked. And the woman's bearing, her calm under pressure, her obvious familiarity with military protocols, it all suggested someone with genuine military experience. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his tone slightly more respectful, "if you really are who you claim to be, you should have documentation that proves it." Rebecca nodded and reached deeper into her briefcase. She pulled out a leather portfolio that contained her complete service record, her SEAL training certificates, her combat deployment records, her commendation letters, and her medical retirement papers. But what caught Morrison's attention was a photograph tucked into the front of the portfolio. The photo showed a younger Rebecca in full combat gear, standing on the deck of a submarine with a group of SEAL team members. She was clearly the team leader, and her bearing left no doubt about her authority and competence. But what made Morrison's hands shake was the notation on the back of the photo. "SEAL Team 3, Operation Deep Rescue, Chinese Submarine Incident." Morrison had heard about Operation Deep Rescue. Every sailor in the Navy had heard about it. It had been front-page news for weeks, the daring humanitarian rescue that had prevented an international incident and saved 37 lives. The operation had been led by a female SEAL commander whose identity had been kept classified for security reasons. What Morrison hadn't known was that the hero of that operation was now sitting in a wheelchair in front of his security checkpoint, being treated like a fraud by his own security team. "Santos," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "get the watch commander on the phone now." What happened next would be remembered at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado for decades to come. Petty Officer Santos's call to the watch commander triggered a cascade of communications that reached the highest levels of naval command within minutes. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh, the base watch commander, had been reviewing the morning briefing schedule when her phone rang. "Commander Walsh, this is Petty Officer Santos at the main gate. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Walsh asked, expecting to hear about a security breach or suspicious activity. "Ma'am, we have a woman here claiming to be Commander Rebecca Torres. She's trying to access the base for a briefing with the CO, but she's in a wheelchair and our gate team thought she was, well, they thought she was lying about being a SEAL." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Santos wondered if the connection had been lost. Lieutenant Commander Walsh knew exactly who Rebecca Torres was. Every officer at Coronado knew about the legendary SEAL commander who had sacrificed her career to save Chinese sailors. "Santos," Walsh said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "are you telling me that gate security is detaining Commander Shark Torres?" "Yes, ma'am. The chief says she can't really be a SEAL because she's disabled." Walsh's response was immediate and volcanic. "You listen to me very carefully, Petty Officer. You do not move, you do not speak, and you do not even breathe wrong in Commander Torres's direction. I am personally driving to that gate, and if I find that any member of your team has shown 1 ounce of disrespect to one of the Navy's greatest heroes, there will be consequences that reach all the way to the Pentagon." The call triggered an unprecedented response throughout the base. Within minutes, the commanding officer, the executive officer, and the command master chief were all aware of the situation. But the response wasn't limited to Coronado's command structure. Lieutenant Commander Walsh made additional calls to the Naval Special Warfare Command, to the SEAL Training Center, and to contacts throughout the Special Operations community. The Naval Special Operations community is even smaller and more tightly knit than most people realize, and news of Rebecca's treatment spread through the community like wildfire. Back at the gate, the atmosphere had become increasingly tense. Chief Morrison was studying Rebecca's service record with growing awareness of the magnitude of his error. Petty Officer Mitchell, however, remained skeptical. "I still don't buy it," Mitchell announced to anyone who would listen. "SEALs are warriors. They're tough, aggressive, elite fighters. This is just some disabled woman with a bunch of fake papers." The comment was so profoundly ignorant that several people in the security line gasped audibly, but Rebecca's response surprised everyone. Instead of anger or indignation, she smiled, a small, sad smile that held more weight than any shout or protest. "Petty Officer Mitchell," she said quietly, "what do you think makes someone a warrior? Is it the ability to walk? Is it physical strength? Or is it the willingness to risk everything for others, regardless of the personal cost?" Before Mitchell could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone's attention. A convoy of official Navy vehicles was speeding toward the gate, not with the measured pace of routine business, but with the urgency of an emergency response. The lead vehicle was a black Navy sedan carrying Lieutenant Commander Walsh and two other senior officers. Behind it came a van carrying a dozen men in civilian clothes whose bearing unmistakably identified them as active-duty SEALs. Behind that came another sedan carrying the base commanding officer and his staff. The convoy screeched to a halt at the gate, and Lieutenant Commander Walsh emerged from the lead vehicle with the kind of focused intensity that suggested consequences were about to be severe and immediate. But she didn't approach Chief Morrison or his team. She walked directly to Rebecca's wheelchair, came to attention, and rendered the sharpest, most respectful salute of her naval career. "Commander Torres," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the gate area, "it is an honor and a privilege to welcome you to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, ma'am." The effect was immediate and electric. Every military person in the area snapped to attention. The SEALs emerging from the van formed a line and saluted in unison. Even the civilians in the security line stood straighter, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Rebecca returned the salute from her wheelchair, the simple gesture carrying all the dignity and authority she had earned through years of service and sacrifice. "Thank you, Commander Walsh. I apologize for the confusion." "Ma'am, there is no confusion," Walsh replied firmly. "There is only ignorance, and we're about to correct that right now." Captain Robert Hayes, the base commanding officer, approached the scene with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command but visibly angry at what he'd been told. Captain Hayes was a career naval officer with 30 years of experience, and he'd served with enough special operations personnel to understand exactly what Rebecca Torres represented. He surveyed the scene, the detained hero, the embarrassed gate team, the growing crowd of onlookers. Then he turned to address not just the gate personnel but everyone within earshot. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "you are in the presence of one of the United States Navy's most decorated heroes. Commander Rebecca Torres, call sign Shark, is a legend in the special operations community." He gestured toward Rebecca, his voice growing stronger with emotion. Commander Torres was the first woman to successfully complete SEAL training and the first to command a mixed-gender SEAL team in combat operations. In 12 years of active duty, she led 47 classified missions, all successful, with 0 casualties among her personnel. Chief Morrison had gone pale, finally understanding the magnitude of his error. Petty Officer Mitchell looked like he might be physically ill, only Santos seemed to be absorbing the information with genuine interest rather than terror. 2 years ago, Captain Hayes continued, Commander Torres volunteered for what became known as Operation Deep Rescue. A Chinese submarine had suffered catastrophic damage in international waters, trapping 37 sailors in a flooding hull. The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. The depth was beyond normal diving limits. The political situation was so delicate that any mistake could have triggered an international incident. Rebecca closed her eyes, the memories still vivid despite the passage of time. She could still feel the crushing cold of the water, could still hear the panicked voices of the trapped Chinese sailors, could still remember the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that lives hung in the balance of every decision. Commander Torres led a 12-person rescue team in the most challenging underwater operation in naval history. Hayes pressed on. For 18 hours in conditions that would kill most people in minutes, she coordinated the rescue of every single Chinese sailor. She personally made 7 dives to the crippled submarine, each time risking her own life to save others. A woman in the security line began to cry. Several military personnel in the crowd came to attention without being ordered. Even the civilians seemed to understand they were hearing about something extraordinary. On her final dive while bringing the last survivor to the surface, Commander Torres suffered a catastrophic decompression injury that damaged her spinal cord. She remained conscious long enough to ensure the Chinese sailor reached safety, but the injury ended her diving career and left her permanently paralyzed. Hayes's voice grew harder as he continued. The Chinese government awarded her their highest civilian honor. The President of the United States presented her with the Navy Cross. The international maritime community created a new award specifically to recognize her actions. 37 families got their loved ones back because Commander Torres chose duty over personal safety. He turned to face Chief Morrison and his team directly. And today, at the main gate of a United States naval installation, 3 American sailors questioned her credentials, accused her of fraud, and threatened to have her arrested. They looked at her wheelchair and saw weakness. They should have seen strength. They saw disability. They should have seen a hero. The public rebuke was devastating and absolute. Chief Morrison stood frozen, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Mitchell looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt. Santos, to her credit, had tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from genuine remorse. But Rebecca raised a hand, stopping the captain's criticism. "Captain Hayes, if I may," she said, her voice gentle but carrying unmistakable authority. "These sailors were doing their job as they understood it. They couldn't have known my background, and they were following their training to verify credentials and maintain security." She looked directly at Chief Morrison, her gray eyes holding no anger, only sadness. "Chief, the fact that you couldn't imagine a disabled person being a warrior says more about our society's assumptions than it does about your character. But I hope this teaches you something important. Never assume you know someone's story based on what you can see on the surface." Captain Hayes nodded at Rebecca's words but wasn't finished with his gate team. "Chief Morrison, you and your team will report to my office at 1400 hours for a comprehensive review of this incident. You will also complete immediate remedial training on disability awareness, military courtesy, and the recognition of retired personnel." He turned to address the broader crowd. "This incident will result in a base-wide training program on respect, recognition, and the contributions of disabled veterans to our military, because what happened here today cannot be allowed to happen again." But the most meaningful moment came when the SEALs who had accompanied Lieutenant Commander Walsh stepped forward. They were active duty personnel from various SEAL teams, but they'd come not as representatives of their units but as members of the brotherhood that Rebecca had helped establish. Master Chief Petty Officer David Chen, a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, spoke for the group. "Commander Torres, ma'am, we wanted you to know that what happened here today doesn't represent the values of the teams or the Navy. You blazed trails that we're all still following, and we're honored to serve in the force you helped create." One by one, the SEALs approached Rebecca's wheelchair to shake her hand and pay their respects. They didn't make speeches or grand gestures. SEALs weren't known for emotional displays, but their presence, their obvious respect, and their quiet words of appreciation spoke louder than any ceremony. As Rebecca was finally escorted onto the base, with Captain Hayes personally driving her to the briefing, she reflected on what had just occurred. The incident had been painful and frustrating, but it had also been educational. For too long she'd hidden from public attention, trying to live quietly and avoid the spotlight her actions had earned. But maybe Lieutenant Commander Walsh had been right when she'd said there was no confusion, only ignorance. Maybe it was time to stop hiding, to start speaking up, to help people understand that heroism comes in many forms, and that warriors aren't always what people expect them to look like. The briefing itself went smoothly, with Rebecca providing crucial insights into underwater rescue protocols based on her unique experience. But as she left the base several hours later, she was approached by Santos, the young petty officer who had been part of the morning's incident. "Ma'am," Santos said, her voice nervous but determined, "I wanted to apologize personally for what happened at the gate, but I also wanted to ask you something. I'm interested in special operations, and seeing you today, it made me realize that I'd been limiting my own expectations about what's possible." Rebecca smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she'd shown all day. "Petty Officer Santos, the most important qualification for special operations isn't physical strength or perfect health. It's the refusal to accept that something can't be done. Don't let anyone tell you what you're not capable of." As Rebecca drove away from Coronado, she made a decision. It was time to stop hiding from her own story. If her experience could inspire even one person like Santos to push beyond their perceived limitations, then perhaps going public again would be worth the attention she'd been avoiding. 3 weeks later, Rebecca received a letter from a young girl in Virginia whose father was a Navy SEAL. The girl, who had been born with spina bifida, wrote, "Dear Commander Torres, I saw your story on the news. I want to be in the Navy like you someday. Thank you for showing me that wheels don't stop warriors." Rebecca kept that letter on her desk, next to her Navy Cross and her SEAL Trident. It reminded her that heroism isn't just about the dramatic moments when lives hang in the balance. Sometimes it's about the quiet courage to face everyday challenges with dignity, the grace to forgive those who fail to see your worth, and the strength to keep serving even when the nature of that service changes. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your appearance or circumstances? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had the courage to speak up? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who needs to hear it. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes come in all forms and that courage isn't diminished by circumstance, hit that subscribe button, because everyone deserves to have their story told. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, and everyone deserves to know that true warriors never stop fighting, regardless of the battlefield they face. Remember, a seal is always a seal, a hero is always a hero, and the ocean belongs to everyone brave enough to dive into its depths.